Lysistrata. Oh my gosh, where do we begin? Next play and last of the semester is going to be Clouds, and it deals with Aristophanes' just about all historians agree unfair characterization of Socrates. So that'll be interesting to talk about when it comes to doing our best to sift out an effective play versus who it is we're talking about and whether or not we think it's fair and all that. And obviously, unless you've done a lot of reading of the Socratic dialogues, I might have a bit more experience than you when it comes to that kind of stuff. So I'll do my best to bring some of that into class and give you some insight into what he may have gotten right and what he didn't. And that's just on the pure historical level. I won't spend the whole time talking about that stuff, but hopefully you'll find that interesting because that's kind of the main thing that that the Cloud stands out for is it's just a ruthless attack on Socrates, who, without whom maybe you got this impression just through osmosis or maybe not. Other than some terrible shit about Socrates, pederast, that stuff. Okay, but when we're talking about him as a thinker, as a philosopher, and then you get through Aristotle in there regarding slaves and stuff too. But when you're talking strictly about, kind of what you derive from experiencing his thought process and his dialogues, etc. Certainly philosophy, but in other ways the world wouldn't be the same without Socrates. So there are very important strides that he made when it came to what does philosophy mean that we'll get into next time. Okay. Today, on the other hand, we have completely other thematics to deal with. What is the main theme of this play? And it's not an unfair question to ask about tragedies and comedies, because you have a good sense, not only from Aristotle when he theorizes about drama, but from other comments made by the Greeks themselves and later the Romans, that they did think in those terms. What is this play about? We do that all the time. Iron Man. Okay, what's his story? Before you go to the movie. Oh, what's his background? What's Batman's background? Oh, he doesn't have superpowers. He has to do it through tools and whatever. Oh, that's interesting. So what distinguishes this superhero from that one? Same thing with these different plays. So what is the main takeaway from Lysistrata? So we're less than 10 years away from the end. We're 6-7 years away from the end of the Peloponnesian War. But this play followed, and if anybody knows Greek history, especially the Peloponnesian War, that by far the deciding battle, or not even a battle, you call it, expedition, was that to Sicily by the Greeks. They just assumed that they could, be successful, but they failed. And it gets real complicated, and it's not a history class, so I'm not going to go into it. But the bottom line is, the Greeks just suffered the worst. The Athenians in particular, the worst loss in their history, to where you're only a couple years away from Athens being complete, lacking in all political clout within Greece and by extension within the world. Okay, so that's how destructive the Sicilian expedition that just occurred about a year or so before this play was produced was for the Greeks. And no one knows, as it says at the beginning of the play, how it did, which is weird, because most plays we know if they got first, second, or third, or no, first, second, or third place, but here we don't know what it was. But what we do know is that this play had a lot of buzz, a real lot of buzz throughout the Greek world at this time, for the obvious reasons that not only are you being brash politically the way you were, say, with Greek tragedies such as Antigone, but you're also dealing with sexual politics, as today we call it. That's anachronistic if you impute it to them, but because they didn't call it that, but you get the drift. So that's what we're dealing with here. What's going on here? What is this meant to be taken purely as a ridiculous joke? And if not, how are we supposed to take it in relation compared to how we took, say, Antigone? I don't know about you guys, I'm thinking Antigone the whole way through. That's just my take. My feel, obviously not, she's not Antigone. I'm saying this is Aristophanes' answer to Antigone, I think. Okay, that's how I feel. That's my sense. Maybe you agree or disagree. But that's my take, is Aristophanes, as he, in the clouds, will make fun of Socrates next time, in a way, I think maybe, to some extent, he's at least in a roundabout way making fun of Sophocles' Antigone. The notion that a woman would be so brash within a 5th century Greek Athenian context to do what Lysistrata is doing, and by extension Antigone was to do what she did. So that's kind of my first impression, and at least on a very superficial level, as I go through the play. In the Antigone does certain things that, within the context of the play, and of course even more so in the real world within 5th century Athens, was by many considered to be hyperbole. Okay, to be ridiculous. This notion that, wait a minute, you have, I mean, in other words, we talked about that in class, this idea. Now, of course, we don't think it's ridiculous, so let's always keep the boundaries in mind. I'm talking about 5th century Athenian mindset, which you would have a lot more insight about if you don't have a lot of experience with this kind of stuff. If this were a class where we spent a lot of time on the ancient Greek mindset, we pretty much spent one day on that, on the overview, and then, piecemeal throughout the semester. But the bottom line here is that we all pretty much agreed that there is something going on more than Antigone being nothing but a powerful, strong heroine. Okay, in the Antigone, we kind of all agree that there's maybe a little bit of irony going on. There's a little bit of even patronization. The idea that, oh, wait a minute, you have an extremely amazing heroine on the stage, hero on the stage. But let's get real, there are no women watching her. A man is enacting her, and so there's no participation by women whatsoever within that, what we might call, or at least be tempted to call, empowering setting of the Antigone. Did you feel that, in the same way that Lysistrata is about female empowerment, did you feel the same way about the Antigone? Does the fact that there are more than one woman, or is more than one woman, are more than one woman, does that take away from whatever kind of patronization or irony there might be to putting women on the stage doing things that in the real world they would be maybe killed for doing? Is there, in other words, does the fact that, is it a matter of quantity? If there are more women doing what Antigone did, we'll call it oversimplification. I'm oversimplifying there, but by them doing pretty much standing up for themselves against the men, etc. Does the fact that it's a collective effort minimize the whatever patronizing aspects there might be to it? If you've taken anything away from this class, I hope it would have something to do with, it really matters how we take things, how we frame things, how we establish issues, and if we feel like it, otherwise just enjoy it and move on to the next play. But if you want to talk about it in a setting like this, there's so many preliminaries that need to be established in terms of framing, in terms of saying here are the issues, and then within that context. Last night I saw a video of a conference, and it was a panel at the most important, indisputably the most important, kind of like for presidential elections, the debates are like the thing, or the Super Bowl for football, whatever. This was the Super Bowl of my field, all right? And it was a panel of people who were arguing that the way classics is done now needs to be changed to the point where even if it dies, that's okay. And this is the people who are running things. And their biggest argument, you could find it online, email me if you want the link or whatever, but the biggest argument was, to really whittle it down here, because there was more, is the kind of horrible shit that we've been talking about throughout the semester, that we've been confronting, the presuppositions about women versus men, about various other things. But it's come up a lot with women. And like I told you, it wasn't pick and choose which things are women most prominent. You take a look at what plays survive, maybe that's not coincidence, but whatever. But especially with Euripides and Aristophanes, women and how they interact with men is a giant issue. And so as I was listening to this, I was thinking, things are reversed. You're so not only wrong, you're absolutely the opposite. We need to study these things to understand where everything comes from, good and bad. or whatever you want to call it, positive, negative, worth preserving, not worth preserving, however you want to, you know what I mean? You don't want to oversimplify with good and bad. What does that mean? Then you get into that philosophical thing. But I'm just saying, as I'm listening, I'm thinking, so what do you want to do? Sweep it all under the rug, and then what? Then move on and just say, oh, that was the stupid past. No, we need to understand where this shit comes from, especially given the fact, and by the way, when I say shit, I also mean where this great stuff comes from, such as, I don't know, the idea at least of democracy, right? We have a representative democracy. We ain't bad. I could say I hate blank, and I won't get killed, right, in this country. We're pretty damn free in this country compared to some other countries. But that being said, we need to be aware that not only are the things that we're talking about throughout the semester, do they exist? They really do, embedded within these texts that we're reading. But this is the very first of these kinds of... They invented drama. So we're reading the very first plays of all time. Isn't it interesting to understand whatever biases there might be sociologically and whatever? So how can that not be seen as a foundation? And then the last thing they and this is, I'll take one more minute of my soapbox. The last thing they were complaining about is having to learn the original languages. Like, oh, that's superfluous. It's bullshit. Oh, really? Okay. Well, the problem with that is that you're going to have to depend on translations of translations of translations, forever. And then it's like the game Operator, where you lose it more and more and more, and then what's the original? Oh, nobody can read it. Can you, there may, if these people have it their way, who are on this panel, one day, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 300, whatever, it may very well be a laughing matter. The notion, oh yeah, right, anybody can read ancient Greek. You know what I mean? It may be that ridiculous, because it's a really hard language, you guys. All right, so it's like, so that's, sorry to take, 5 minutes on this, but that seems to me kind of related to what it is we've been doing throughout the semester. We're reading the plays, we're enjoying them for their artistry and craftsmanship, but also whenever necessary, such as with the Lysistrata, and I guess Euripides in general, bringing up the social issues is also really important. Come on, there is one, in my opinion, one absolutely irrefutably most important scene in the whole play. Anybody, as you're reading it, run across a scene where you're like, oh, this is the crux of the whole play? This is my opinion that it's the most important. It's not like some test or something. But how will you women unravel? So the magistrate already starts off the metaphor. So this is one extended metaphor, as they call it. Okay, extended metaphor, where you're calling what you're doing something which is obviously similar in some ways to what you're really doing, but you're not saying like that or that. That would be a simile. All right. So this book is like what is it like? A cake, whatever. Like a cake. That would be simile. This book is a cake. That's metaphor. So on the surface, the difference between those is very small. It's a matter of an extra word, but obviously it's a conceptual notion. Overtly comparing versus actually saying that love is a rose. Okay, that's a metaphor. Okay, so this is a metaphor. So how will you unravel? And in the original Greek, unravel is the same word used for all the stuff that Lysistrata is going to be talking about with respect to weaving and all that. So let's, in a way that we didn't really do for the frogs, I was hoping we get a little more in depth about the critical aspects of the comparison between Aeschylus and Euripides. Let's not miss the opportunity here and take a look at some of the things that are being said, in particular, in this 2-page passage. What's the purport of what's going on here? Can anybody kind of generalize as a whole what the analogy is? What the analogy is between the weaving and running things rather than the men doing so? I was thinking Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, long-suffering, Penelope 10 years after the Trojan War, waiting for him to get back home, staving off the suitors from forcing her to marry one of them, because you need a king to replace Odysseus. Weaving is the locus amoenus. Okay, it's not often used, but what that means is the ultimate place you go for the best example of blank. Okay, that's in the locus amoenus, old-fashioned comment. The locus amoenus of weaving is this idea of Penelope staving off the suitors by pretending to be weaving, and then once getting really, really close to the end of it, unraveling it again, and then putting it back together again, unraveling it, putting it back together again. So, as I was reading this, no, it's not like they didn't go out of their way to make an analogy with Athena in particular, or with Penelope in particular, but do know, you guys, that the more you read of Greek literature and Roman literature later on, but I'd say especially Greek, the more rich your experience is in reading these later works. Okay, this is late relative to Homer, hundreds of years later. You get these little bursts. You know that bursts of flavor. Do they still have those commercials where you chew on the candy and the crap comes out? Whatever, remember that? Yeah. So you get those little bursts of associations, is what it's called. And so the more you read of this stuff, the more rich your experience is because of that. And so there's definitely something going on there. So in other words, as we're reading the details of this scene, there is no doubt that the audience member is meant to think of it in a more exalted light, as a more important scene than would be the case were those associations not in the background. That's all I'm saying. So you see that throughout all of tragedy and comedy. You get these associations because it's kind of a closed system in a way, even though we don't have all the plays. But for the Greeks it was, the Athenians it was, a kind of closed system. That was their semiosphere, the place where you go for all kinds of references and this and that, whereas now things are a lot more decentralized culturally, to where we don't have as many of those touchstones as we used to. I don't know what the hell you watched last night, if anything. You used to be able to pretty much be able to guess, because there were 3 channels, and for the Greeks, even more than for America in the 70s with the 3 channels on TV, there was this sense that there was this one game in town. And of course, as an intelligent audience member, the Athena connection and the Penelope connection, etc. All right, that being said, what's going on here? Let me ask a very explicit question. What is Lysistrata trying to get across to the magistrate right now? This is Lysistrata pretty much, and it's the first time it happens in this explicitly in any work of literature, telling the men, you fucked up, and we can do better. That's really what Lysistrata is saying here. Huh?
The first of many women to say that. Just in
right. Well, that's the point I'm making. That's where this, more than a motif, but we'll call it that. That's where this motif comes from, right? You get little hints of it in Euripides and obviously with Antigone in a big way, but that's a little different as you hear it straight out. We're at war. This is a war that's going to destroy us if we don't stop it. And I'm just putting it there, I'm not, you men failed, and the only hope is for us women to take over. And the only way we're going to be able to do that and convince you to do it is what? Sex strike. All right? Now that's funny because you can say that to someone who hasn't read it or seen it yet, and right away, oh wow, it's about a sex strike? That's interesting. So there are different levels of this play. Loosener of armies. So her name, as is common with comedy, because you know that it's not realistic, so you might as well go as far as you can with symbolism. Her name means exactly what her function is, to loosen the army. Now, hopefully, depending on if you've taken languages and stuff, you can't be real precise when you go one-to-one correspondences from one language to another. So it doesn't only mean loosener of armies, it also means disruptor, disbander is how it's often translated. Disbander of armies, okay? So that's the idea. Okay, and then by extension, ender of war. She's the war ender, okay? Now interesting, Lampedo right? Lampedo is which one? She's from where? You guys remember?
Sparta.
Yeah, she's the Spartan woman. And two things, at least, occurred to me to say about her is, first of all, her etymology on the surface means the bright one. But one permutation of that root, meaning bright, guess what? Guess what it means? Her name, literally, means haughty. Isn't that something? Because think about it, white hot, light illuminating. Okay, there's that connection. So she's haughty. So we got the ender of war and the haughty. How can you lose? This war ain't gonna last, right? It ain't gonna last. So Lysistrata, the other thing I thought of when I reread this for the millionth time, when Lampedo, and I only noticed this today, when Lampedo enters the stage, enters the drama, what do we call it? I guess it is drama, the comedy. Do you guys remember? When she first comes in, it's kind of worth not paraphrasing, but actually looking at it. Don't worry, we'll get down at the very bottom of 426. Don't worry, we'll get them to go along with us. Lampedo. I don't see how. Not with triremes all primed for sea and bottomless holds of brass in Athena's treasury. So, two things to say about that. Number one, Lampedo, the Spartan, is the one that is consistently portrayed as the voice of reason in the play. And she is the Spartan, who is the, and when I say enemy, I'm talking about a year earlier. It's like us if we, whoever, I totally don't get political in classes, but whoever we might be in a war with, and a year before, there was this horrible battle that the United States was at war with, bad English, but you get my point. A year after that, imagine a comedy. Hey, come on to a comedy, watch play. Hey, and then the voice of reason of the play, with pretty much without irony other than the overall irony of it being a comedy, is a representative of the enemy who is more than just an enemy in a general sense, but one that we just had lost many people to in war with. See that? Interesting, at least to me. Okay, and then the other thing, then it's your turn. Stop making me do this. Okay, but then the other thing about this is that, Lampedo brings up the fact that, and later on it becomes clear, maybe earlier, I forget, that it's the older women who are going to be in charge of barring the gates of the treasury. Now, what treasury is that? Hopefully, in the 2 days that I talked about it to you, that overview day, and then later on I spent a little more time on it, you know which treasury we're talking about. What treasury are we talking about? The Delian League is that little club that Pericles, who we talked about in connection with drama, etc., didn't start, but took over. And that's the treasury that the Greeks from all over Greece every single year came to Athens to pay tribute to in order to protect them from any future foreign enemies. Okay? And so that's the treasury that the Spartan, representative of the Spartans, Lampedo, is talking about, is referring to as something that needs to be barred. And anybody in the audience watching this play would know that, with a few minor exceptions, the Spartans were the only polis that didn't play ball with the Delian League. So there's an interesting kind of thing going on there too. There's a lot of interest, rich historical effing around with things going on with Aristophanes. It's not a coincidence that he is one of the favorite kind of specialties in my field. The surface things are just kind of the equivalent of maybe, not quite a sitcom, that comes later with new comedy, but hilarious, fun, having a good time, everything, laughing, ha ha ha, sex jokes and this and that. But there's some serious political stuff going on below the surface, especially given the fact that Aristophanes was lucky / unlucky enough to live in maybe the worst times to be born in Athenian history. okay, because you're really close to where, as far as what Athens was in its heyday ending, okay? Not Athens altogether ending, but what it was in its heyday, right? Then you move elsewhere in the world for a sense of cultural kind of epicenter energy. But yeah, Athens lasted at least a good, depending on who you ask, 50, 100 years as the cultural center, kind of the Paris, what Paris was, say, in the 20s, in New York, I guess. In general, what is going on here is that women, within the context of the play, I'm not saying this, don't YouTube me, women within the context of the play are exploiting what they believe to be what they excel at more than men, stay with me, enough to justify using it as the main weapon against the men to end the war. Okay, that was a really good point, because I think that in at least on one level is what's going on here, and so the women are they well, Lysistrata in particular identifies using sex as a weapon, or the withholding of sex as a weapon, as the thing that women, as a manifestation of female power that can be used against male power, the guys who go to war. Okay, now that's one, if you only take it that way, in my opinion, naive level to look at it as to limit ourselves to that level. It's not naive in and of itself. It was a great point. But I'm saying it would be naive of us to stop there. And in the few minutes we have, 1 minute we have left, whatever, what's the next level of meaning to all of that? Please, somebody tell me. What's, to use a big word these days, kind of offensive about that? Ever hear of Sappho? One of the greatest poets of all time, not one of the greatest female poets of all time, but mentioned by Ezra Pound, who is one of the greatest 20th century poets of all time, as one of the greatest poets of all time, if you followed me. All right? Sappho is one of the greatest there is, period, and we only, this, we only have the most important poem of hers that really lets us know who she, why she's so great, because of one wrapping of one mummy found in Egypt. Her stuff was, if you want to call it cynically, suppressed, you can, or disappeared somehow. But we only know about this great, great, great female poet because, and we're calling her that because, we don't have anything else complete of hers except one poem. We have a few other, maybe two poems, I forget. But anyway, not much, mostly fragmentary stuff. If it weren't for a chance finding of a poem that was barely preserved on the wrapping of a mummy, we would not be able to be as assertive in our taking something like that as extremely patronizing, at least when it comes to the ancient Greek perception of women, not ability, because women, have always been capable of whatever Sappho was capable of, most likely, of all, forever. But the point is, if we only had this way of portraying women, we wouldn't have as good an argument against it if we didn't have the poetry of Sappho, not because there weren't Sapphos in the world who could create great poetry, but because we wouldn't have known that women actually did create great art like that in ancient Greece. Okay, and because of that, where I'm sitting, it seems like it would be overtly, hopefully on purpose, by Aristophanes to be considered to be extremely patronizing. Oh, the one thing we women could do is have sex really well. You know what I mean? So we're great at sex. That's our best thing. The men are best at war. So you the last idea here, you exaggerate in order to make points sometimes. And I like to think that that's what Aristophanes is doing. You see? Because he was aware, probably, that Sappho and other female poets were doing great art. And so I can't help but to impute to him those more noble motives than simply making fun of women as being able to do nothing but sex.